Hello,
Yeah.
George. Nice to have you here again. And today we're tackling these more scientific, interesting topics like phenotype, genotype. So I'm going to be very interested to hear your definition of them and how you think they affect particularly cattle and the cattle industry. Over to you.
Well, I suppose my whole philosophy is keep it simple. And so we'll start with the simplicity of the quantitative genetics is what we're talking about when we talk about selection. We select animals for a purpose, and nature selects animals for a purpose. So there is some driving force. And we have a very simple little formula, which is to me the remarkable thing about quantitative genetics, and it can be, that simple formula can be made incredibly complex, but it's the basis of very. It's the phenotype, P we call it in the formula. It says is what you see or what you can measure. So that's in front of you, and that phenotype consists of two components. That's a genetic component and an environmental component. In other words, if we write it down simply, note it down, E equals G plus E. The phenotype you see or you measure is a product of two things. It's an additive thing. It's the genetic component in that animal and the environmental component. Now, what we try as geneticists is to sort this out a bit. If we want to make changes, we've got to try and get a handle on G. And E is always a big influence. We can take, growth, for instance, is a simple thing. We can weigh an animal. If you weigh that animal, if one mob have been starved and another mob being fed, there'll be a huge difference in P. It'll be due to E, the environment. One was fed, one was starved.
Mhm.
Massive difference. But G stays the same. The genetic components of those two do not change. That's the constant. That's what we're driving at to change. We're trying to find the G component for desirable traits, characteristics, and we have to be able to then negate the environmental product to do that properly. So this is coming back to, and I suppose you alluded to, maybe we'll just go on to EBVs. Today it's a common term. Everybody banters it around. It's become part of the general, I suppose, vernacular now. It rolls off the tongue. It sounds good. It sounds scientific. It sounds impressive. But the basis of that little EBV is essentially to get the best estimate of the genetic component, and we'll stay with a simple one like growth, is to say if I select for growth, what is its heritability, the component, the genetic component that's going to be passed on to the next generation. That
Mhm.
is genetic change. We're driving the genetic change because genetic change is free. The environmental component can cost money. You look at industry, the amount of feed the southern industry pours into animals to give P a good look, the G stays the same.
Right.
Yeah, you can take a lousy animal, and we've done that, and really uh, feed it to its eyeballs, and it looks magnificent. Its G is lousy, but it looks magnificent. So this is what the stud industry sort of built their whole reputation on. That is why cattle have to be presented, otherwise nobody's interested in it. If you take a group of animals, and we done it in a field day, and I should start with that because that was one of the interesting things. When I started interacting in a serious way with the cattle industry, with the DPI in Rockhampton, most of the DPI, I'd say 99% of them, let's say beef cattle husbandry officers, had no concept of the genetics. They were still then putting out pamphlets how to prepare your bulls for shows. In other words, the whole thing was on E, driving E. And sure, E, the bottom line is what you're going to get for that bull. So if he looks lousy, you're going to get nothing for him. If he's dressed up to the nines, going to everything going for him, he's going to make money irrespective of G. So it's a game of deception that's become a tradition. And this is, I suppose, the beef cattle industry, if you look at all the primary industries, is the last vestige of tradition, an expensive tradition, on which the cattle industry pride themselves is looking at animals, picking them by eye. Irrespective, we go to the sales. I'll take the Belmont sales as an example. The association, and that was maybe my influence way back, before even we were using EBVs, was just performance test. And the EBV is just a performance test, sophisticated one, is that so they presented the information in the sale catalog. But some breeders were better dressing the cattle than others, and that's just management, or how much you want to put, how much grain you want to put into the animal and sell it on the hoof rather than sell it straight out. So it's selling cattle on the hoof, or selling grain on the hoof, I used to call it. And it was difficult to get this through to the DPI officers. Most of them had bachelor's degrees and also a lot with diplomas from Gatton, but nobody had ever dealt or taught these people this. And I think Tom Wright, beef cattle husband, deceased now, we became very good friends. He saw the impact that the first bulls taken to Pat Maynard's property, and that really rocked them. And now, how do we get this through to the industry? So we decided we would put a field day on at Belmont. I think it was about 1973, 74. And Belmont, Greg Turner, I think I mentioned him, was an introvert, and they actually did have a field day in 1957 to show the industry the results of the F1. And they got a caning from the traditional, because the industry hadn't at that point accepted Brahmins. They were still old. The only meat you could eat was elephants and angus. For God's sake, this other stuff was dog's meat, if they had long ears and arms. So they put this on, and they got caned by the industry. For some reason, really were upset, the political leaders, about saying that these other cattle were so superior. I didn't think they'd done a good job. I wasn't there, so I can't speak. But I said to Turner and Co., my superiors, we're thinking of having a field day at Belmont. It wasn't well received, I can tell you that much. But I persisted because I can at times be big-headed. And Tom gave me a lot of support. The DPI came in with us. So we said we should really do this to justify having this damn research station. Now let's see if we can get through to the industry. So I said, okay, we'll make it on this PNG. So I took out of each breed, that's the Brahmin crosses, Afrikaner crosses. We didn't mention this terrible name Belmont Red, and the British crosses. On their performance in the paddock, we did not drench. We had to save the elephants every now and again. They were then culled, they were struck off as dead to keep them going. But so I took on their performance. We took about, I think, it was about 5 of the top of each just on their performance, and 5 of the very bottom on their performance. So we had the maximum difference on what would be largely G, because they're all running together for each breed or each crossbred. The very lousy ones took to the sheds where they done all the experiments on nutrition. Unfortunately, the guy that was there was an ex-stud master at a big stud in South Australia. And he was, so I said to him, years 15, you keep a record on what you're going to feed them. You fed cattle. Oh, yes, I've got prepared cattle for shows. Yes, of course, I said. So I'm not going to give you an unrestricted, but you feed them to the eyeballs. And you know, treat them as you would treat animals. You can dip them, drench them, you can scrub them, you can wash them every day. You just prepare them for the top show. So it's the Sydney Royal or something. And he really took this on. The other mob went back into paddock with all the rest. We had a lead in, I think, of nearly 6 months before the field day. And you could see these lousy animals. Every month we were weighing out of the paddock and that looking. Every month, John Dick was his name, the chap at the shed, used to come over. Yeah, came there and he said, where are your good animals? I said, that one. Oh, God, he said, you're crazy, you know. And so he had those animals prepared. Even the elephants, they were sleek, you know, they were beautiful. The field they come. Somehow it must have been well advertised by the DPI. We had over 1,000 people at that field day. It erected big stands. So we had a feeling because the DPI officers from Norman, to the west to Longreach, they were all promoting this. And so it was a very big day. So we put these animals and we demonstrated all our other things, but the main thing was these animals. And they were put, so you had 10 Afrikaner cross, 10 Brahmin cross, 10 British, each in their pit. And each of the participants that wanted it was given a sheet with numbers of these animals on. And they had to rank them from 1 to 10 on their phenotype. And there were big names like Graham McCamley, Dick Wilson, the top heavyweights in the stud industry were there. They didn't want to miss being seen. And we collated the results. Every one of them was 100% wrong. Absolutely wrong. Now, it was still a difficult take to convince them how wrong they were, but a lot of them did. Yeah. What they were selecting on was environmental. It was a reverse of the genetics. The genetics was so far depressed in there. This comes to the basis of the selection that we on performance, and this is objective selection. They have to be treated the same. And when we treat them the same, we negate the environmental differences. They all have an equal opportunity. And you're trying to then get the best estimate of the genetic and actually heritability of growth rate. And under that system, which I've practiced all my life, is quite high. Just selecting them on their performance. And that had a big impact and caused a huge amount of discussion, which was what we wanted. It was put out there, and now they could start dealing with it. So it was a demonstration of phenotype and genotype. The phenotypes were hugely different, massive difference. Anyway, so you then come, as I said, the complexity of that little equation can be that you can have an environment, an interaction between the environment and the genotype. And this may be coming towards this term of epigenetics. But I suppose from then on, at least, we had the beef cattle husbandry officers all singing from the same sheet. And I think it was a big impact. And we come back to this the whole time. But even today, we still get it. I don't like his head. It's, a little bit pinched here. It's a little bit cow-hocked there. The face is too long and the ears are too short. God, things that are irrelevant.
Exactly.
And the one overriding factor is condition. You put a bull in at a sale that looks like nothing, you can't even get into the meatworks. So
So,
I suppose that's the starting point of selection. Now,
so a
I'll just go
question.
on.
Can I
Yes,
quickly ask you a question? You use the word performance. You select on
yes,
performance. Can you unpack that a little for us?
yes. Okay. I should. It's their ability. It's like performing in an athletic race.
Mm-hmm.
The guy that wins, the guy that loses. You know. So it's the performance and for every trait. I can say
Okay.
fertility, a high performer versus a low performer. You want to pick the high performer,
Yep. Okay.
not on his looks. Purely, it doesn't matter how ugly he is. If he wins the race, he's the
The
winner.
winner.
You may not like his looks, but he's the winner. The guy that's Lancer, you don't want him in any case in your team. So if I'm using growth. That's the trait. But for every trait, it's the objective measurement of that trait.
Mm.
You have to deal with these things. You have to quantify. If you say, if we look at an animal and conformation, even, what's your concept of conformation? What's my concept? It's
Mm.
largely opinion, not a fact. But if we weigh that animal and we know the background, all of them have come together, and we have the same set of scales or a set of scales that don't vary largely, we're still going to, pick. We can't argue much about the weight. Yeah. You may say, oh, well, I read it, it was half a kilogram difference or something. So what? That's objective. You say, oh, I like that animal because he's got a beautiful head. And I say, well, hell, I like that one because he's got a beautiful hump, or he's
Mm.
got a tight skin, or you can go on and on. But once we decide that the trait we're interested in is, so on objective selection, you can't quantify it. It's an opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. It's very difficult to argue about facts if the facts are correct.
Right.
So that's performance. It,
Right.
it applies to everything. So
Good.
yeah, and that is change. And then let's go back again. Changing a population. What we're trying to do, or endeavoring, whether we doing it objectively or subjectively, our I suppose goal is the same. We're saying, we're improving the herds. Okay, we're making them better. We're implying genetic change. Yeah. What is the best method to reach that genetic change? Yeah, judging is an art.
Mm.
Selecting cattle on their performance is a science.
Science.
Objectively, quantitating is a science. The description of something is an art. It's the same, go to an art gallery. What you like, what I like, and the artist, it's an art. You can't measure it, you can't quantitate it. Yeah. So measurement is the basis of it all, and then how you use it is the next thing. So then we come down to the basis in the early days before we developed the concept of the EBV, and that was a logical thing to come. Was that as I said that time, growth rate before EBVs, it's 1974. Pre-EBVs, but I was using objective selection way
Mm-hmm.
back, even before that. And I could measure it and I could see it. And I had actually established the heritabilities. And I had actually done an experiment, which we call divergent selection, to get a realized heritability, where we picked the best, mated the best of the best on performance, on growth,
Mm.
purely at about 18 months of age. The best, the worst on performance. So the herd is split. The bulls have a big difference, the cows less, because you split all the cows. So right at the overlap, there's, and selected them on their 18-month, about 16 to 18-month weights. Weight for age, you adjust for age. This is an adjusted weight again to get a better measure, objective measure. And I mated them and then looked at their progeny and the realized heritability, which is, and that was the only experiment ever done on cattle in the world, this the one I done, showed a very high heritability. So I knew I was doing the right thing with my objective selection. EBVs were developed by a chap called Henderson at Cornell University, a graduate of Iowa State University, which I attended, from the father of quantitative genetics in cattle, J.L. Lush. And the reason Henderson developed the EBVs, and he was brilliant, an ex-return soldier, by the way, was that they were working Cornell University, New York State, at Cornell. Their clients were all dairy breeders, New York State, dairy. You can't, measure the milk production of a bull. You can measure the cow. So you had to, in effect, select the bull on the cow's performance. That's the way it was done. And in those days, what they used to do, because AI was the driving force then of any changes, they selected on the basis of the cows, but you had different herds, different feed, different environments. In the dairy industry, not as large as what we would get in the beef cattle industry. So how did you deal with this? You had these herd differences. And how did you maximize the amount of information you got from the cow to apply to the bull? The very early days, they used sire differences. So they'd select the best they could, and they'd mate them to a fairly large cohort of cows in commercial herds, and then measure the milk production of the daughters. The best bulls of those then went into the AI program on the production of their daughters. And that has a relatively low heritability because of all the variables. I mean, people are feeding them. So Henderson said, we need to extract more information from the maternal side. And he then came up with the EBV based on performance, same thing. So what you do, you then start adding in information from the father, information from the mother, information from the grandfather, and you do this by the genetic relationships. In other words, close relations, say, daughter's son is half the genes. The next is a quarter of the genes come in. The next is an eighth of the genes. So you weight this performance by these bits of information, and you say it's only about 25% or 12%, 12.5% of the information, and you weight that. And you take the established heritability, you weight that. And that is an EBV.
Okay.
So it was driven by the dairy industry and Cornell University. I was fortunate that time period was when they were starting to apply this at Cornell. And a lot of my cohorts at Iowa State, 3 of them ended up at Cornell University as professors. And I got to know Henderson as well. So I was impressed. I was in the States when they were starting this. It made so much sense. And we were actually dealing with it at Iowa State theoretically with our professors because very strong interbred relationship between Cornell and Iowa State. So I was familiar with it. I actually developed crude EBVs for the Belmont herd. But when I got there, these guys were so far ahead. They had much better computing facilities, and we had very good. And at Cornell University, I visited there and spent a few days there with these ex-friends of mine. And I said to them, you buggers have got the brain I need to apply it in Australia. Let's test it on a beef cattle herd. They hadn't really tested on any beef cattle. I said it should apply to beef, and they convinced me it would. So we got the leading of those trio. I convinced him, and I got Henderson to put some weight on him. He's reluctant to come, a chap named Quas. And I was at a meeting in Brazil with Henderson. I said, you tell Quas, he tells me when he's coming or he's not coming. Tell Avisa. So I'm getting sick of not hearing from him. When next Quas sent me an email, said, arrange the times. So he came out, and Belmont, the Belmont herd, was one of the first herds in the world where EBVs were applied to beef cattle. So that was the start. So we were quite instrumental in that sense. Certainly I was bringing it in, we were way ahead at that stage. And we applied it then to all the data we had at Belmont. And we could then measure the genetic trends of our herd since I had started selection and things. So it was interesting in 3 different strains of cattle if your system. In other words, you could validate it from the Belmont data very well because the data was so good. That was the establishment of EBVs. And
so,
then,
George, let me just try and understand. So obviously this was owned by a university, which would be Cornell University, the actual formulas and the formulation and all that. Did they sell it and privatize it? Is that how it got into breed plan?
No, initially not. No, initially not. The American universities worked very close with the industries. As I said, Iowa State was a leading university, and Cornell was riddled with Iowa State graduates. Henderson was a Iowa State student of Russian. They were all, I said, inbred. You could have gone to Norway, and the head of the genetics department was Iowa State. Vienna, the head was there. It was internationally, they said, the lush school. It was everywhere. Edinburgh in England, all the top universities in that, if they had the school of animal genetics, somehow the heads came back to Iowa State. He was an incredibly influential person. I had the lucky period of actually getting to know him very well. This is Professor Lush. He's retired by then. Remarkable person. In your whole life and your career, you meet some exceptional people that really are giants. He was one. So, and Henderson was the other as well. I got to know him very well. So, anyway, but that's the history of the EBV. Now, the more complex it got, as I said, from that simple little, we then, another thing that the concept of the genetic correlation. Now, the correlation is 2 traits or 2 measurements. What is the relationship or the covariance between them? Correlate 2 things and use it. What is the genetic? That was a concept. Heritability was a concept of Lush's. The genetic correlation was a chap who taught me, who was near retirement, Hazel, concept Iowa State. Those concepts in the genetic correlation, and it's really, that correlation is the probability of the genes in common affecting a trait. And so that is so you're not measuring, you've excluded the environment, because if we just correlate two things, it's 2 weights, it's one thing. But if there's a genetic correlation, then it means you've excluded the environment. And that makes that little PNG, you can break it up, makes it more like the G component can be broken up into what we would call sort of fixed gene effects, dominance variables, and others. You can keep in the same with the environment. There's permanent environmental effects, temporary environmental effects here. And these things, so you can, then you expand this little until you've got a very complex type of, and then when you start adding onto that, all that information from the parents, the grandparents, and even the siblings and the cousins, and all that information then brought together, makes your measurement, the estimated breeding value, so much more valuable. It's much better because it contains so much more information than just the animal's own information, which is a simple one of performance test, growth rate. How much better is bull A, or bull A better than bull X? And that's your environment. That basic concept has to be adhered to. It's in, you cannot, but now we get where when you have enough information and bulls are being used across herds, you can say we can eliminate a lot of the environmental differences between herds because we know this bull's been used in these herds, it's been used in these herds. We can start taking out the environmental differences between properties. So you keep on growing in sophistication with more information.
Right.
The danger is, and there's always this, is that people then become so obsessed that they assume that that measurement is exact. It's not. It's a huge, what we call standard error. And the more, if we take with, let's say, the bulls, it's not between herd differences and so on. If there is not enough connectivity, then that difference between the herds is much more suspicious. And we've got to the degree of sophistication in computing, and probably AI may help with this, is that the linkages are weak. Yeah. If, let's say, I take your herd and my herd and we use the same bull, just one bull, that linkage is very strong. But if you're using 10 bulls and I'm using 10 bulls and only one of those bulls has a cross linkage, we base the difference between the herds on that, it's pretty weak.
Yes, yes.
So you can see it's a numbers game as usual. And so what I suppose concerns me, and I haven't kept up with all the detail of the computations at ABRI, is that there's just too much faith put in that little figure. It becomes a driving force. And we're also driving the whole selection process towards a higher degree of sophistication, which we're paying for. Yeah, and that's irrelevant if you're making enough money. So you go to all this degree of sophistication of computing and, the boffins you have to support and God knows what. And they, of course, driving it because it means, they stay in the job and they get promotions. So that's very important in any public service system. But your clients, the customers, are now, I think, being led to believe that this is gospel. That's all you have to rely on, and you shouldn't. You should always, as an animal breeder, have the final say in who you pick. In a way, you see this where, as I just said earlier about the Belmont sales, you can give all the information you want, then go and look at the price that was paid for those bulls. There's virtually zero correlation. They're not looking at the figures.
Right, they're looking at phenotyping,
on the day they're looking at the phenotype. All this information which they paid for, they believe in, but on that day, and if you really believe, as I do in performance, and I'll always take the simplest one, I would say you could have a catalog and sell them purely, don't even show a photo of the damn animal, just his figures, and buy him on that. Don't confuse yourself if you believe it. Take the figure and buy it on it. It'll be much better than going to all this and then sitting there in the stand and saying, hell, his head's a little bit this, and God, I don't like his eyes, and he's a little bit pinched here. I mean, the vocabulary alone of the studies should be catalogued, because you need a dictionary to keep
a glossary of terms.
Yes, absolutely. And that still drives the price, unfortunately, because they're tradition bound. They're not going to let go of their egos or their ability as a good cattleman. They don't want to sit in the stand and bid on an animal that looks like rubbish. I mean,
Yes,
it's going to destroy his reputation. Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Nobody talks about the EVEs.
Mm.
Listen to the stud cattle, the auctioneers. It's quite amusing. They have no clue what they're talking about.
No,
They try and make
exactly.
it exciting,
Yeah.
but they always come back to the good looks in the eyes at some stage. So, yeah.
So, okay, I think we'll end this
Yeah.
discussion here, but what I'd really like us maybe to explore next time, if you are happy to do that, is what do what would you think are the really important things to focus on from a metric perspective? Take me, for instance, I've got a very small stud. I really don't think I can go on to breed plan. There's just financially, it makes no sense for me. And the Boran doesn't really have a baseline on breed plan. So, you
No.
know, if what would you think would be the things I need to focus on to improve my herd? So I'd like us to really talk about that next week, if that's
Yeah, that'd be good. Yeah,
okay.
simplicity.